3 months ago, the US resumed selling arms to Bahrain despite ongoing violations of human rights. As police continue their crackdown on protesters, we ask, how can the US recalibrate its policy to ensure its ally moves away from violence and towards democracy? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. For almost every single Arab country that's seen uprisings over the past 2 years, the US has called for regime change. Except for the Gulf country of Bahrain, one of its closest allies in the region. Security forces violently crushed the mass protests which began in February of last year. Demonstrators were arrested and tortured. A year and a half since the uprising, and reports of abuse continue. According to Human Rights Watch, the government is arresting and prosecuting members of the opposition for exercising their right to free speech. And the government has yet to hold any senior officials accountable for the torture of opposition activists. In a hearing on Capitol Hill last week, US State Department official Michael Posner said the US must be straightforward in its assessment of the country.
We've also been consistent in our criticism of the use of excessive force by police, including tear gas, birdshot, and nightly raids and arrests of protesters.
But despite these concerns, the US continues to back the Bahraini monarchy. The two countries have had a close relationship for over 60 years. Bahrain is home to the Fifth Fleet of the United States Navy. Posner added in his testimony that the US-Bahrain relationship is particularly important in the face of rising threats from Iran. Earlier, I spoke via broadband to Bahraini opposition activist Mariam Al-Khawaja. I asked her what she would have said were she to testify before the US Congress.
The human rights violations, basically, that we've been documenting for more than a year now have continued, and in some cases have actually gotten worse. The Bahraini government has gotten really good at making a lot of empty promises, which gets a lot of international attention, but then unfortunately when it comes to implementing them, it usually doesn't go through with that.
For example, we've been hearing a great deal about how torture in prisons has ended. Would you agree with that assessment?
Definitely not. As soon as a couple of days ago, when they arrested around 40 people in one night during one of the protests, which was called the self-determination protest, we received several reports of people who were beaten. In some cases, it seems to have amounted to torture. There were children under the age of 18 who said that they were reportedly given electric shocks by the police officers. And so we definitely have received continuous reports throughout the many past months that torture has continued. That has changed to a certain extent from official police stations into unofficial torture centers, which was actually documented also in a Human Rights Watch report.
How would you assess the US's role in all of this?
President Obama made a very good speech in May where he spoke about the things that needed to change. He spoke about the demolition of mosques, and he spoke about the political leaders who were imprisoned who needed to be at the dialogue table. Now, unfortunately, there's been no follow-up on that. On the contrary, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton actually came out and said that Bahrain had the sovereign right to invite the GCC forces into the country, which caused a huge problem because in a way it legitimized their presence, but also it made it impossible for activists to get any other country to condemn the entrance of these forces into Bahrain. And then from there, what we've seen is statements from every once in a while, so they're not consistent. And usually every statement will start with, Bahrain is a US ally and friend, and then they'll make some light, condemnations of some of the violations that are ongoing. But I think one of the most disturbing issues is the fact that the United States resumed selling arms to Bahrain, despite the ongoing violations, despite the fact that the Bahraini government did not implement their own recommendations, and also the fact that, a US former police chief, John Timoney, was actually brought to Bahrain in what was called an attempt to reform the police. But unfortunately, since then, what we've seen is that the violations by the police have actually increased. So what people right now feel towards the United States in Bahrain is that the United States is to Bahrain today what Russia is to Syria.
What do you mean by that?
Well, you know, Russia, what's seen in the Syrian situation, and of course you can't really compare the situation on the ground because of the difference in violence and so on, but Russia has a base in Syria. And throughout the Syrian uprising, Russia has consistently supported the Syrian regime. Now, what's going on in Bahrain is sort of the same thing. The United States has based the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. And what we've been seeing is that instead of taking a very strong stand against human rights violations in Bahrain, they've actually supported the Bahraini government by giving them arms or selling them arms amongst, you know, very lightweight condemnations against human rights violations. But in reality, there hasn't been any real pressure to attempt to stop the human rights violations that are still ongoing and widespread in Bahrain.
What do you make of the argument, though, that such is the complexity of the region and such is the symbiotic relationship between the US, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia, that the US doesn't necessarily have the sort of leverage it takes to push Bahrain and Saudi Arabia towards democracy?
I disagree because, I mean, first of all, the United States needs to be consistent when it comes to human rights and supporting the call for human rights. They cannot say that, you know, we're going to support human rights in Syria, for example, or in Egypt, for example, or wherever else it happens. But when it comes to their allies, they say, well, you know, because they're an ally, maybe we won't support the call for human rights and freedom. It really ruins the credibility of the United States, not just in Bahrain, but in the entire region, when they have such double standards. But also, I think, you know, for many people who live in the region, they know that Bahrain and Saudi Arabia and other countries really depend on Western support, specifically from the United States, to stay in power. And so the Bahrainis are in need of the United States administration more than the US needs the Bahraini regime to stay in place.
So, should the US reconsider its policy towards Bahrain? Joining me to discuss this, Jay Stork, the Deputy Middle East Director for Human Rights Watch. We also have Saudi dissident Ali Al-Ahmed. He's the director of the Institute for Gulf Affairs. And Mann Leverett, US foreign policy professor at American University and co-author of the blog RaceForIran.com. Jay Stork, what was surprising about that testimony from Michael Posner, the representative from the State Department, was how quietly damning it was, at least in the written testimony. In fact, actually, we have a bit more of it here. He noted that as far as the State Department was concerned, there was excessive use of police force and almost nightly confrontations between young protesters and police. He also noted that Bahraini authorities often denied permits for demonstrations. He said the US authorities had numerous reports of disproportionate measures, like the abuse of tear gas and birdshot to control crowds. Many demonstrators are afraid to seek medical treatment. The US continues to see reports of continuing reprisals against protesters. He noted there are 100 criminal cases still pending, adding that many individuals have been in detention for over a year. And he said, on the whole, there's little evidence Bahrain is moving toward a negotiated political settlement. But Jay Stork, in the end, though, his conclusion was, well, but let's keep on carrying on in the same way that we have for the last year and a half.
I mean, Mr. Posner's not just a State Department official. He's the Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Rights, and Labor. So he was kind of obligated to speak to the issue of human rights. Okay, and I think the basic thing is that in those kind of forums, or like at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, the U.S. will say the right thing, but they'll kind of say it in the quietest. Mariam made a good point. They'll say it in the quietest possible way. Look, I think the United States knows exactly what's going on in Bahrain. They're on the ground there. They're very concerned. I would say they're even freaked out about the situation there. But they're not willing to sort of go where they have to go, in my opinion, which is to speak publicly and more loudly. And particularly, we have a lot of high U.S. officials going there, military officials, security officials. You know, it shouldn't be just Michael Posner. It should be the head of the Fifth Fleet who's saying those things as well.
Is there a clue, perhaps, though, also in the first paragraph of Posner's written testimony? I mean, again, it's perfectly honest. In the first paragraph, even before discussion of human rights abuse, Mann Leverett, quote, the US-Bahrain relationship is particularly important in the face of rising threats from Iran. There's no messing about there then.
No, not at all. I mean, the problem for the United States is that we're stuck with an ally like Bahrain. Like, we're stuck with some of the allies that we have in the Middle East. And that's because our strategic interests, as U.S. officials have framed it now for decades, is essentially oil in Israel. And oil is personified in the state of Saudi Arabia. So any country that is willing to align itself, collude with Israel and Saudi Arabia to give up their own sovereignty, to do whatever they do to their own citizens in order to work with Israel and Saudi Arabia in U.S. interests, those are our allies. Now, those allies, sometimes they're better, sometimes they're worse, sometimes they behave better, sometimes they don't.
But Jay Stork
We're stuck
says
with them.
they're freaking out, though. I mean, they do view with distaste the brutality of the Bahraini regime, but what,
yes,
the only constant remains?
I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as freaking out. I think the concern, the problem for U.S. policymakers is with the advent of the information revolution, something that Al Jazeera has been great at, it's harder to be stuck with bad allies. It's harder to justify having an alliance with a country, with a government that abuses its own citizens and carries out policies that are against its own interests.
It's what's happening in Bahrain. It's not just information that's getting out. It's what's happening, the polarization in Bahrain, the demonstrations every night.
Bahrainis have done this for decades. Bahrainis have done this for decades. I think the critical, of course, things are, I would say, they're incrementally worse now, but this has happened for a long time. I mean, the British, the Bahraini government colluded with the British to bring in people from India a long time ago. There have been problems in Bahrain for a really long time. The critical concern politically, strategically, I think in the White House is it's harder to get away with it today. But Ali, you can't stand there like when I worked in the Bush administration with President Bush on the eve of the invasion of Iraq with the King of Bahrain smiling and saying everything is great. You can't do that anymore. Even though it was wrong probably for the King of Bahrain to support the U.S. invasion of Iraq, we could get away with it then, we can't get away with it now.
Ali Al-Ahmed, Joe Stork there mentions the increasing polarization. That is clearly a deliberate action on the part of Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, it seems, I mean it's alleged, to stoke the sectarian tension. But is it clear, Ali, from what you know, that Bahrain or Saudi Arabia do actually have a plan, or are they just taking it day by day themselves?
I think they have a strategy. The strategy has been in force for a long time. In the Gulf countries, one of the most useful and effective tools has been the use of the sectarian cars within these countries, all of them, all the Gulf countries, not only Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, because these countries, the largest division in these societies are sectarian. In certain areas there are also tribal, but this is the most effective weapons that applying the rule, divide and rule, that has been really a long time strategy used by these monarchies to stay in power. So.
But looking at the US's strategic interests, Ali Al-Ahmed, I mean, this began as a non-sectarian, democratic, peaceful movement. Do you think the Obama administration ever supported the opposition in Bahrain?
Absolutely not. I just want to say that the Obama administration not only supports the Bahraini government, it is actively working against the democracy in Bahrain. The White House, National Security Council, used the word rejectionist to call the people of Bahrain. And this is a very derogatory term that is used. They borrowed from the Bahraini officials who are calling the Shia majority, which is a derogatory term. As much as the N-word is used against blacks, the word rejectionist has been used in the White House to call the Shia majority in Bahrain. So you are really...
It's easy to counter that. I mean, you know, George Washington was a rejectionist, okay? That's just what you say to these guys when they used words like that. That's ridiculous.
But it doesn't matter.
The United States cannot, in terms of how its strategy is currently composed, it cannot support the opposition in Bahrain, because if the opposition in Bahrain had any real say in the power in the government in Bahrain, they would never allow Bahrain to cede its territory to the United States for the Fifth Fleet to be used as a platform to attack a much stronger neighbor. That makes no sense strategically.
How did President Obama's foreign policy become so wedded, though, to this one certainty amidst all the uncertainty, that Iran is the North Star we follow?
Because Iran is the defiance. Iran stands up to U.S. plans for dominance in the region.
But even in the face of the potential instability this might be causing to other parts off the region that might have longer-term consequences? Is it simply fear? Is it a lack of creativity? Is it some idealism in the neocon way that that Iran does have to be, the regime change from Iran will lead to a better world?
Its strategy is focused 100% of the time on oil and Israel. Iran stands as the dominant power to defy that, to resist that, to oppose that. The United States needs to do whatever it can in whatever country it is in the Middle East to push back against that, no matter how destabilizing it is.
And there's no discussion in the administration as to how effective that is actually proving.
Well, and we did the same thing in Asia long ago with Vietnam and Korea. We wanted to contain China against U.S. domination in Asia, and we are willing to fight the last American and the last Chinese person in Vietnam and in Korea. When our pursuit of dominance can be ferocious. It has been ferocious in the Middle East. It was ferocious in Asia. And countries like China and Iran literally are standing up to that. And that's the problem that U.S. policymakers have been bedeviled with since the end of World War II.
Joe Stork, there is another way of looking at this, though, that in conflict resolution, sometimes there's very little to be gained by lambasting dictators in public. It's something that has been pointed out on this show in other contexts, in Syria and elsewhere. Is there any evidence that that is what's going on, that there is behind the scenes pushing of the Bahraini regime?
I actually think there has been, and I think there have been times when you've actually seen it work. I think you saw it work back in mid-February 2011, when after the first killings of the demonstrators, the troops were pulled off the streets. I think that had something to do with phone calls that were made from Washington.
The only reason we started selling arms again to Bahrain was to give those forces within the regime something to come home with and prove that
I think that's the rationale, but I think it was an absolutely wrong decision, because what it did essentially was say, you can send this moderate, the Crown Prince, over here anytime, and just as long as he comes back with a few more goodies for us, the head of the armed forces.
Weapons that will kill.
And Joe is right in a way. I mean, it does work. It works temporarily and it works incrementally over time to keep a pro-American government that is working against the interests of its people, both in terms of their human rights and their geopolitics, control over their own territory. It works to co-opt members of the royal family in Bahrain, as it works to co-opt members of royal families and other governments throughout the Middle East.
Al-Ahmed says that they don't even actually support the opposition in the first place. They co-opt to what end, exactly?
To keep the government in place. A government in place that is going to carry U.S. water and not Bahraini water.
We shouldn't, we shouldn't oversimplify. And the fact is, the Bahrain ruling family, just to take the ruling family, it does have divisions. There is a hard-line faction that's in control now. It's certainly been in control since the middle of 2010. And I don't think the U.S. actually is my view is the U.S. isn't particularly happy that that's the case, but they don't see any alternative. It is the case, and their view is that pushing these guys harder is just going to make them, there is this Sunni sort of chauvinist line in Bahrain reflected in pro-government media that there's this enormous U.S., Iranian, Hezbollah
and
plot.
Al-Qaeda,
All about it, right?
Yeah.
So, it's complete nonsense. It's complete fantasy. But they're frightened of this, and they haven't learned how to sort of step up and call a spade a spade.
Ali Al-Ahmed, from your knowledge then of Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, how effective is that strategy on the part of Washington in trying to influence events in the Gulf?
Well, I think Washington could be very influential in the Gulf, especially in Bahrain. It doesn't really take a lot. Unfortunately, like I said, the the American government is lock in step with the Bahraini monarchy and in supporting them, and even refusing to call for a constitutional monarchy or even a real dialogue between the opposition and the government. So they're not even willing to do that. In terms of Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia obviously does not want any change in Bahrain that involves popular participation in power, not only in Bahrain but in Kuwait and other countries in the Gulf, because these absolute monarchies don't want to encourage or give ideas to their own people to demand change within Saudi Arabia, who want the parliament and elected officials and so on. So it's really self-serving.
They see it as an existential threat. And
yes,
they see it as an existential, and the Bahraini ruling family sees it as an existential.
And that's why it has to be militarized, because if the United States actually had to compete with its narrative of what the U.S. stands for in terms of good policy with these populations, it would lose in a second. So what it has to do is it has to militarize each one of these conflicts. It has to give weapons to the military, to the government in Bahrain, because that's the only card the United States really has. It can't compete in the world of ideas. It can't compete with narratives like you see on so many shows.
Does that mean then, when we ask and other people ask, how does the U.S. recalibrate its policy to push its ally towards democracy rather than violence? It just shows even to ask that question is to reveal a fundamental misunderstanding of the entire situation, because it's a pointless, it's a stupid question in some ways. Then,
in some ways, it is. I mean, it would mean that the United States would have to give up its pursuit of dominance. It would have to come to terms with the key players in the region that are resisting its pursuit of dominance, specifically the Islamic Republic of Iran. And if it were to do so, you wouldn't need to have $60 billion arms sales to the Saudis and to the Gulf. You wouldn't need that. It would make no sense if the Islamic Republic of Iran were a country you're working with and not arming countries to the teeth to fight against.
I think it's a mistake to see all of this in Bahrain as a prism, you know, through the prism of Iran. I mean, yes, the Bahrainis, the Saudis, and to some extent the United States have shaped it that way. I agree. And it's complete, you know, there's no basis for it. I mean, this idea that Iran is behind the Bahraini political crisis is total nonsense. There's been no proof of it. The independent commission said we can't find any evidence. You look at the WikiLeaks releases from the Bahraini U.S. embassy in Manama. They don't have, you know, they asked the government, where's your evidence? None is produced.
If in the second term of Barack Obama,
Can I make a very funny point about that? Just a very funny point. I was at a round table, one of these dinner tables they have in Washington. The Bahrainis have paid a great PR firm here to promote their cause. And there was a senior Bahraini official there, and the Bahraini official was trying to talk about Iranian complicity with the opposition. He said, you know, when we went into that hospital, there were Hezbollah T-shirts.
Right. Yeah. If President Obama has a change of heart and he decides, and I suppose the way, or is it a way out, to use the US influence where it does have influence instead of simply being focused on regime change where it doesn't have influence? Would there be any potential, though, for democratic transition in this area?
I think there is, but
I'm blowing your mind with the concept.
There are people in the ruling family in Bahrain who happen to currently be in charge who do see the kind of change that we're talking about, that we would like to see, as an existential threat. So they're going to dig in. They don't see any way out. This is not an easy sell. Unlike, you know, I disagree with Ali there. It's not easy. But I think it requires consistency. I think it requires public diplomacy. I think U.S. interest in retaining and expanding its dominance. I agree with Hillary there, but I disagree with her in terms of seeing it all as a, you know, I don't think it's seen as totally a militarization issue. It's also seen, they're using this, you know, they do see a need to sort of ultimately come to terms with
survival depends on it.
The street, as it were. The street, as it were. I mean, but that's a long-term kind of abstract view. Meanwhile, the people they have to deal with day to day is the head of the armed forces, it's the prime minister, it's the guys who, you know, are the root of the problem here.
I mean, Bahrain, like Israel, if it didn't have the military might of the United States goading it to be provocative against its neighbors, would actually have to, what we call, you know, box in its own weight class. It would have to deal with the reality of a large Iran, a large Iraq, a large Saudi Arabia, and make accommodations and get by. But because it has the United States, like Israel, it can do things that are much more provocative to its neighbors. And in doing so, it's perilous to its Shia population, because they're pitting Bahrain against Iran in a way where the government has to lash out at its domestic population. And it's done so not just recently, not just under the Obama administration, but even when the Khalifa were aligned with the British. They were taking people from the colonies, from India, and bringing them to Bahrain and giving them citizenship. This is not a new issue.
But Ali Al-Ahmed, as long as Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, they continue to jail and torture peaceful protesters who are fighting for democracy, at what point then do those protesters decide that the only alternative is armed resistance?
I think, to be honest, if I was asked as a consultant what to do, I would do that, exactly that, because in reality, that's the only way that the United States will realize it has to do something. If the Bahraini revolution becomes armed and U.S. base becomes under threat somehow, then the United States will say, oh, okay, we need to have some kind of a solution. Right now, because of cultural indifference, I think primarily that the United States policymakers have really do not put a lot of weight on the value on the people in the Middle East and the people in Bahrain and their lives and freedoms. Otherwise, they would not have received the Bahraini Minister of Interior, who is responsible for killing the equivalent of 22,000 lives in the United States. So really here, arming the Bahraini revolution would make a huge difference. Of course, it will lead to loss of lives on both sides, but at the same time, it will make a difference in the U.S. policy, because the U.S. policy has proven itself to be lagging behind and not listening to the voice of reason, but to the voice of bombs and guns before it makes a change. And it's really in the interest of the United States to adopt this peaceful revolution in Bahrain. I really think it is a way for the United States to create a new discourse in the Gulf for its policy by adopting and supporting the voice of the people, the aspiration of the people in the region for better government. This way the United States will cement its position in the Gulf.
Last word, Hillary Mann Leverett.
I think if we intervene in Bahrain on the side of the opposition militarily, just like some of our allies have intervened and ourselves in Syria on the side of rebels, we will destroy their narrative. Their narrative is for popular participation, is for their rights, is for their sovereignty. Time is on their side. If we intervene and hijack that like we did in Syria and Libya, they're not going to have their rights. They're never going to really push back the balance of power.
Well, I think we should be talking in the real world here. I mean, there's no, the U.S. arming the Bahraini opposition.
I'm not sure that's necessarily what I was suggesting, actually. I mean, there's no suggestion that the opposition would cooperate with the U.S. But whether they would then turn to armed resistance is the question, though, I suppose. As peaceful.
Well, this is a big struggle for ideas. I mean, but the critical thing that they have on their side is their narrative. They need to keep that and harness it, and not let foreign intervention come in and militarize it.
Then we have to leave it. Hillary Mann Leverett, Joe Stork, Ali Al-Ahmed, thank you all very much. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.